Well, welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Randy Bluffstone, and I'm professor of economics here at Portland State, and I also direct the Institute for Economics and the Environment. It's really my pleasure to welcome you here today, and also our distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Norgaard. This is part of the Environment, Economics, and You speaker series of the Institute, and I would also like to mention that next week, Wednesday, February 8th, we'll be welcoming Riley Dunlap, who's a sociologist and has been working for many, many years on climate deniers and the politics of climate change. And that won't be in this room, it'll be in Smith Memorial Student Union, but I think also a very interesting presentation. The topic for today, economics, religion, and the climate change crisis, a long view. It's of course an interesting one, which is, of course, not surprising, given that our speaker has been a long-standing and insightful researcher and commentator on a variety of issues, and really has helped move our understanding of the intersection between economics and the environment forward in I think, very important ways. But those three words, economics, religion, climate change, stringing those three words together, at least for some, I think, could be viewed as a bit of an oxymoron, kind of like a fine mess or awfully nice, something like that. But in reality, just a brief introductory remarks, I'd like to try to mention that I think the linkages between these words are really pretty deep and meaningful, and so I'm really looking forward to Professor Norgaard illuminating, kind of adding to this and helping us understand a little bit more. So let's start with economics and climate change, the first two words that maybe some think don't go together. I'd like to assure you that the economics of climate change, it's a very, very vibrant subfield of environmental natural resource economics, and it's one that I try to contribute to myself from the developing country, the lower income country perspective. One example of the work that just recently has come out is a National Academy of Sciences report on estimating the so-called social cost of carbon, which is an attempt to estimate the value of the extra damages associated with emitting a ton of CO2 rather than not emitting it. At least for the moment, the official U.S. government figure is about $45 per ton of CO2 emitted, and that's almost universally regarded as an underestimate. So this National Academies of Sciences report, I think, could be very, very helpful. And Professor Norgaard has contributed himself in many areas, I think, but one that I'd like to highlight is his work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific arm of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Professor Norgaard contributed to the 2015 report, the Working Group 3 that dealt with human behavior. So climate change and economics go together, I think, in important ways. Religion and environment, those have perhaps never been more closely intertwined than they are today, and we see a really burgeoning movement in a variety of religions in the U.S. and elsewhere that explicitly challenge people to connect their faiths with the natural world and preservation of the natural world in particular. And of course, one really important example of this, and kind of urging us to consider the environment before printing, is Pope Francis's 2016 encyclical, Laudato Si, which seeks to make the environment a focus of religion and people's theological reflection. And this was a very dramatic move, of course, because the Pope was representing the priorities of 1.2 billion Catholics worldwide. So that this extremely important document and explicitly links these two things. So this leaves economics and religion, which you might think, or some might think, really don't go together. I don't know. But this actually has also a long history and a vibrant present. Perhaps not surprising, because I was just reading and preparing for this talk that the Pew Research Center estimated that in 2010, 5.8 billion of the then population of 6.9 billion, about 84%, identified as religiously affiliated. So religion is still a very, very, very important part of the landscape today. And kind of in response to that, there is a subfield of religion and economics. And it turns out that last year a review was produced by Srira Iyer of Cambridge University in one of our professional journals. This paper emphasized a two-way causality inherent in linking economics and religion. And probably the most common directionality that we think of is from religion to economics. And probably part of the reason we think of that is because of Max Weber's famous work in the early 1900s in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which asserted that there was that linkage between the Protestant background and the evolution of capitalism. But it's also possible that economics can affect religion, and I won't go into that, but think Prosperity Church as one possibility. Going back to the beginning of economics, even to the 1700s, there was a vibrant debate on this at this intersection of religion and environment, and especially between Adam Smith and David Hume. Adam Smith being one of the founding economists, where Hume argued for state religion, and Smith, not surprisingly, argued for competition between religions. I think that's not too surprising. More recently, we see just a burgeoning literature in this area, and I'll just mention one by an author that maybe you want to put on your radar, Benjamin Friedman of Harvard University, who writes in this area with titles like The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth or Economics, a Moral Inquiry with Religious Origins. These are things that have come out in the 2000s. So the subdiscipline of economics and religion appears to be alive and well, and we're really very pleased to be able to learn more about the climate change aspects of this from Professor Norgaard. Richard Norgaard is Professor Emeritus now of Energy and Resources at University of California, Berkeley. He received his BA in economics from that same institution, and an MS in agricultural economics from Oregon State, so some Oregon linkages. PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Professor Norgaard is one of the founders of the field of ecological economics, and his recent research addresses how environmental problems challenge scientific understanding and policy process, how ecologists and economists understand systems differently, and how globalization affects environmental governance. Dr. Norgaard is the author of one book, solo book, co-author or editor of 3 additional books, and over 100 peer-reviewed publications spanning a variety of fields, including tropical forestry, development, environment, economics, and a variety, truly multidisciplinary. Though an eclectic scholar, he's also among the 1,000 economists in the world most cited by other economists, so both within discipline and across disciplines. Dr. Norgaard has served on numerous committees of the National Academies of Sciences, was a member of the U.S. Scientific Committee on the Problems of the Environment, also, as I mentioned, a part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the 5th assessment team, which is a very, very important scientific institution, and was president of the International Society of Ecological Economics from 1998 to 2001. Now, Professor Richard Norgaard, he'll present for about an hour or so, and maybe hold questions till the end. So write down your questions, and we'll pass around a mic at the end and make sure that all questions get answered. We'll definitely allow a half hour for vibrant discussion and questions. So with no further ado, Professor Norgaard.
Okay, thank you. First time I've had a post to hang on to if I get a little, tired. I'm very pleased to be here, and I am going to mix up economics and religion. There's not going to be too many dollar signs, maybe none. There's a lot of reasons why we have difficulties with acting in America on climate, and climate denial is by far and away the most important. So I'm not denying climate denial, but I am going to argue that the way we have, as a nation, thought of climate and climate economics is an important reason that we're not making as much progress as we should. And so that's the central argument, that economics, as just looking at it as economics, is too narrow. And we really need to combine economics and moral thinking together, and they do combine together, and I'll get into that and show how. but that is essential to actually making progress on climate economic thinking today. So I'm a little bit at a loss here. I don't quite read the screen. The screen down here is a little small, but I'm going to argue that economics and religion have been intertwined from the very beginning. People have succeeded because we're social. We've succeeded as hunters because we do it together. And when you do it together, you do it better if there are social mores, if there's standards of how it ought to be done. And we've succeeded because we have shared the take from the hunt. The hunters don't just go off and eat it by themselves. They share it with family, they share it with the young, they share it with the old, and they share it with the hunters that weren't so lucky that day or that week. And again, it helps a lot to have social moral rules as to how to hunt together and how to share together. And that's religion. It just wasn't very formal at the time. It was just moral thinking. And so because we're able to be moral people, not just social, bees are social, but I don't think bees are moral. But people can be moral. And that quality goes way back and has a lot to do with our success. Our success as social people is enhanced greatly by moral rules. And as we're more successful, as agriculture comes on, our population grows much larger, our groups get much bigger, we get hierarchical social organization, and we begin to get specialization, and some people specialize in religion, and they become religious leaders, and others specialize in warfare, and so things began to get sorted out. But in the beginning, they weren't sorted out. They become sorted out because of their growing size of population, and that again comes because of the success of our organization. But still, through the vast majority of human history, we knew that productivity was enhanced by social rules. We knew that we need to take care of each other, and there were standards for doing that. With the Enlightenment, there's an effort to come up with secular moral standards. And there's a long story behind this. Philosopher Stephen Toulmin argues that the 30 Years' War from 1608 to 1648 just was so chaotic and religion was so entailed in all the confusion that the intelligentsia kind of got together and said, we've got to come up with rationalizations for social organization that don't have this tight bond between the rulers and the religious powers. And so we begin to get the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is definitely set out to come up with secular ways of thinking about what is right and how we should socially organize. And economics is a part of that. Economics is a part of that. Now, when we think about the Enlightenment and this effort to get a secular understanding of how we should organize, this was a political agenda to break the power between the church and the state and set up a new relationships between religion and social organization. But that doesn't mean these people were not personally religious. Almost all of them were personally religious. It was the social question that was bothering them. How do we socially organize in a rational way? And that led to the secularization of moral thinking. And Adam Smith is a part of it. And Adam Smith, though there are economists that went before him, was especially important because basically he says markets make both parties better off. Good comes about from markets. Good comes about from greed, from individuals acting individually in their own interest. Ooh, but that's really interesting. And Adam Smith also used moral language, religious language, referring to the market as being guided as if by an invisible hand. And you know exactly what the invisible hand is, as if guiding the market is. And Adam Smith also begins to get the sort of the basis for an economy actually growing. Most of economics before Adam Smith was about how each different parties can get more. You know, should the landlords be getting more, or how can the state get more so the state can be strong and fight wars? But Adam Smith really says, no, everybody can become better off through markets, and the whole system can be better. And that's an important point. The Enlightenment ideals get played out in the United States. There are hundreds of socialist or communes or just communities, economies, experimental economies, alternative economies. There are some still today. But more so than in any other place in the world, the United States is this place where, gee, there's all this land. If you just forget the Native Americans, the building which we're in, it appears to be all this land and a place to run experiments and how to set up new religions, new social organization, new ways of making the land productive together. And so we're this incredible place of experimentation. But again, these are economies where the social organization, the economic organization, the moral bases of people working together all had to be worked out. And there was not this great separation. That separation, I had one more slide. I should be looking at my other screen a little bit. This was a day when communistic just meant commune, just living together, just learning how to live together. Oneida is one of the more famous. Economics and religion in America are also heavily intertwined because there weren't too many ways to get educated besides becoming a doctor or becoming a minister, a priest, or becoming a theologian. And in the early days, a lot of economists were theologians. Adam Smith himself was a moral philosopher. You know, he wasn't an economist when he started out. He was a moral philosopher. And so that trend is carried on in the United States later, in time. It takes us longer to get economics departments set up. The alternative is journalists. A lot of early American economists were journalists, in particular Henry Carey and Henry George. And they had very strong religious views. They are also very able to communicate effectively by using religious language because we are a very religious nation. We've come here to do all our religious experiments and did. And so they were teaching economic ideas very strongly using religious language. And so this gets picked up by the religious community and played out, and there's clear connections. McVicker is one of the earliest theologians who are also holding an economics post. He's actually the first economist who's a professor of economics, but he's trained in theology, and he's at Columbia University. And he didn't do too much economics himself, but he reviewed a piece written in Scotland, and then at the end of it, he had these very interesting words. This picture about how the economy is supposed to work presupposes virtue in the people. Political economy is a science which guards against involuntary, not voluntary, error. It enters into harmonious alliance with religion, but cannot supply its place. It must find public men true to their trust. Otherwise, economics, renders them more ingenious in their abuse of power. Okay? And, we see that today in spades. And, maybe I should have put Trump University up there with Volkswagen, but I just wasn't quite brave enough to put Trump University up there with Volkswagen. But yes, people of virtue are important. And that also plays out in trust. That it's very hard to run an economy without trust. If you have to have a lot of enforcement of everything that everybody says, which also has something to do with the politics of the current age, it's very hard to run an effective economy. You have to have trust. And again, that trust is built in by mutual respect and by having a mutual background of how you should behave in a social context. But this interrelationship between religion and economics runs deep in another way. In the 1880s, some mathematical philosophers, also interested in moral issues, tried to build a mathematical model of the economy as a whole and see if you could actually do it. And they kind of did. They didn't really quite do it. It wasn't really done until 80 years later with Ken Arrow and others. But they came close. And what they discovered, however, was that they could have economies with different efficient solutions. That you had to set up something in first. You had to set up who had which resources in the economy and then run it from there. And you could set it up with the parties in the economy having relatively equal distributions of resources, like Sweden, or you could set the economy up with very unequal distribution, like I used to say Brazil, but now I say United States. And they could both be efficient. Both economies can be efficient. And that's really important, and we're taught that as economists. We teach each next generation, and then we kind of weasel word around it. But basically, if we have an inefficient economy, like the one at point A, this is just an economy of two individuals, because they had to make some simplifications, and you want to make it more efficient, you could go to B, but you could also go to D and make individual X much better off, and individual Y worse off, and it would still be efficient. And economists kind of set out the rule, well, let's try to go to B. Let's try to make both parties better off most of the time. And that's what we try to do. But I'll come up with this graph again. It may be that we should be going to some point like C, which may look a little more like Sweden. This was picked up in America by religious scholars, religious theologians, in this case a congregational minister in Columbus, Ohio, Washington Gladden. And with the rise of corporate capitalism in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Americans were really quite shocked. Sort of the Jeffersonian agrarian democracy was all of a sudden looking like Europe. It was all of a sudden people were rushing to the cities, the economic opportunities were in the cities. There are all kinds of new ways of sinning in the cities. And this led to what eventually became called social gospel, sort of theologians who were concerned about, gee, now we live in a society where it's really hard for individuals to not sin because of the structure of the society. And so Randall mentioned Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical. That is social gospel writ large. But the reaction of the religious community was quite strong. And Gladden also pointed out that economists know that economics itself cannot solve this problem. The choices that need to be made cannot happen just by the market, letting the market work. That we have to intervene, and we have to intervene with moral choices. So if I go back to this frontier, choosing between point B or C or D is a moral choice. It has lots of moral consequences, but you have to have a society with moral criteria and moral ways of acting, methods of acting. To say, gee, we really ought to go towards C. We certainly shouldn't go towards D. And economics needs that to function. And that was known. Okay, I think I just went in the wrong direction. Not unlike me. The first really well-trained American economist, Richard Ely, was also deeply involved in religion. And the founding of the American Economics Association, Richard Ely was the founder or the main instigator of the founding of the Association of American Economics Association. And there were 20 ministers there. Now, you don't think about that when you think about the history of the economics. 20 ministers at our founding? Well, there were. There was also quite a battle. There was a great battle between those who wanted an association that would just make them more professional and those who wanted an association that would solve problems and make this a better society. And Ely was caught right up in the middle of that. But he himself used religious language all the time. There was the Chautauqua Institution, and Chautauquas all around the United States, many Chautauquas. And they were the tweets of today. They were the social media that Obama was elected from, and they were the television that elected John F. Kennedy. These changes in media are really important, but the Chautauqua was a place where people would come together, and people of religion and people who were scholars. And Henry George was there, and Richard T. Ely in later years was there. And these were all mixed up at the time, but still not so mixed up now, but needing to be. So Ely brought religion into his economics. He wrote about religion and economics. But this fight I was mentioning about the objectification, we want a society that says, gee, the people who belong to this society are skilled and scientific and objective professionals, or is this a society that's going to raise the rabble and get something done? And the people who wanted a professional society won. And there's quite a few books written about this, so I'm not just speaking from a few sources. But as characteristic Ely language, who would want to join an association that does not stand for anything? And the association has not stood for anything since. Economists have organized in and around and outside the organization, but the association itself has never taken a stand. So religion and economics continue to be mixed up. And an important founder of the Chicago School of Economics, and Randall mentioned that I'm from the Chicago School of Economics. I have trouble saying that. I was there for a very short time and continued to learn, and did not go to become a part of the priesthood, the economic priesthood. But Frank Knight co-authored a book with a person, a theologian. He wrote on theology and economics himself. He was very interested in it. But most people thought of him as a microeconomic theorist. He wrote famous texts on microeconomics, market economics. But he has something else to say. And in a famous article, not an unfamous article, because this should be taught in every economics course, the point is that the principles by which a society or a group live in tolerable harmony are essentially religious. The essential nature of a religious principle is that not merely is it immoral to pose it, but to ask what it is morally identical with denial and attack. There must be ultimates, and they must be religious, in economics as anywhere else. If one has anything to say touching conduct or social policy in a practical way, man is a believing animal, and to few, if any, is it given to criticize the foundations of belief intelligently. And here's the catcher. To inquire into the ultimates behind accepted group values is obscene and sacrilegious. Objective inquiry is an attempt to uncover the nakedness of man, his soul as well as his body, his deeds, his culture, and his very gods. This is the one I wanted to show. Certainly the large general economics courses should be prevented from raising any question about objectivity, but should assume the objectivity of the slogans they inculcate as a sacred feature of the system. So if you've had an economics course that felt like that, it's not because your professor read this, but the profession has been asked to teach that way and has developed a tradition of teaching that way. But in many ways, we need social rules of behavior, and economics is central to our social rules today. And so I'm going to just make a point early. If you didn't believe the economy was going to work, if you didn't believe the supermarket was going to have your food, or the local farmer's market, the farmers were going to come to the farmer's market this weekend, you would, well, most of us only have flower pots to plant our food in, but we'd be desperate to figure out what to do. We'd be trying to go back to land as fast as we could, and 8 billion people could not go back to the land. So we have to have faith in the system we have created. And in many ways, that's what Frank Knight was teaching or writing about, but he wasn't really teaching this. He was pondering the incredible depth of what has been created during the 20th century in building a whole social system around economics so strictly and pushing a few things further and further back. So in some ways, economists have to do it this way. But there's another thing going on. During and after World War II, the neoclassical, neoliberal economists got together and formed the Mount Pelerin Society. There was a dozen or so individuals that grew over time, and they basically had an agenda of teaching a market-based theory of economics that tried to put the religious aspects off to the side and also tried to minimize government as much as possible. And there's lots of good reasons why the Mount Pelerin Society was created. There was a certain fear of democracy after Germany turned Nazi, and all the disasters that happened from that. And they were really, some of them were really thinking, if we could just set up a system where power was so dispersed among all the people, then some of the atrocities that people can commit by making political mistakes or following false leaders could be avoided. And that was very much a part of the background of these people coming together. But some of them just hated government and just thought markets were, perfect. So Milton Friedman down there on the lower right, not the far right, but down the short guy, I took courses with him and knew a couple of those other people. I never met Friedrich Hayek. So again, I'm not speaking without background. There are now about a dozen books written about the Mount Pelerin Society and the whole effort of neoliberal economics to become the dominant way of thinking in economics. But another thing is that economists became involved in government. The 1936 Flood Control Act stated that the Army Corps of Engineers that built the dams on the Columbia River and the dams elsewhere in the world. There are so many dam proposals coming to the Congress. The Congress stated that the water agencies need to come forth with benefit cost analyses to help Congress decide which dams are worth building and which are not. And to do a benefit cost analysis, you're automatically assuming that some people are going to get benefited, and that's okay. And other people are going to be paying a little more than share of the cost, and that's okay. And the rationale, again, at the time was, well, on the average, that's going to average out. Or we're going to build the Tennessee Valley Authority because there are a lot of poor people in the Tennessee Valley, and they need help, and that's okay. So there's kind of moral reasoning behind it. But again, for economists to do benefit cost analysis, they had to violate a lot of their theory because it's very difficult to come up with an answer saying this dam is better than that dam without saying it's better to benefit these people than those people. You can't. And they came up with sort of standards that they then avoided. But I'm just showing that diagram again. There was also the problem that President Truman said, give me a one-armed economist. I don't want an economist that says on the one hand this, on the other hand that. I need an economist that says, this is the answer, give me the answer, a one-armed economist. And, in fact, economics is a lot like ecology. There are different patterns of thinking in economics. And this model here is called a general equilibrium model. And that's different than a partial equilibrium model. But those are different than a Keynesian model, which are different than monetary theory. And then there's institutional economics and behavioral economics. And maybe the list doesn't go as far along as the ecological list goes. But economics has different patterns of thinking, and yet economists have a deep desire, in a part because they themselves become a little too religious about coming up with right answers for society. And yet we can't do it without moral criteria outside of economic reasoning. And yet we were put into a political system that was asking us to do something that was sort of beyond our theory. It was in the midst of the Cold War. We were fighting the Soviet Union. And, okay, so I've mentioned the one-armed economist. So in the Cold War, we get, and again, Randall mentioned prosperity gospel. We begin to get religious communities speaking in favor of markets, religious communities speaking against the Soviet Union and saying America is the country that God prefers. And in effect, God prefers markets to socialism. It wasn't quite that blatant, but sometimes when you read it, it comes out that blatant. But this was actually stimulated by the Advertising Council. The Advertising Council during World War II was busily helping people learn how to eat margarine instead of butter and live with 2 gallons of gasoline a week and commute together, and trying to give sort of the most social mores necessary to work together as a nation to fight the war. And then after the war, they said, look, we've got this capability. Why don't we use it? And they worked with different Bible institutes, the Moody Bible Institute in particular, but others as well, and helped sort of develop a capitalist religious theology. And it's in this time when we get "In God We Trust" on our dollar bill, and "Under God" in our Pledge of Allegiance, and become this godly capitalist nation as opposed to the ungodly socialist nation. So again, this is a whole nother mix of religion and economics in our history that we are not entirely unmixed from, because prosperity gospel is the largest growing aspect of Christianity. A lot of it's now growing beyond the United States, but and it's very tightly tied to favoring markets. We literally have Christian economists who sort of say God, really meant markets to be. Okay, so I've gone a little bit ahead, but I'll let you read what I thought I was saying. So this is also the time of prayer breakfasts, and we still have prayer breakfasts, but prayer breakfasts were introduced. So this all kind of comes together with the neoliberal Chicago School of Economics, and Milton Friedman is just an incredibly good communicator, both in the written word, but also as a spokesperson. He honestly likes people. He enjoys being in front of the camera. He did enjoy being in front of the camera, but he was just a very good communicator. And he and his wife, Rose, wrote books together, showed up on television, and were very good promoters. And this leads to the transition to the Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl, 1980 sort of Western world going into neoliberal economics. Okay, so I've already said, could markets even exist if we didn't have faith in them? And so to some extent, I really worry as we try to come up with ways of getting to an economy where we're consuming less and still being happy, where we're coming up with meaningful lives which aren't just the joy we get from rolling out something in the big box store on a big cart, to some other economy. How do we switch if it is something that we have to have a deep faith in as well? And so I don't take this as a small problem, or it's a crucial problem, it's a critical problem to me, but I'm not looking critically at either religion or economics. I'm not blaming either. I'm just saying, here we are, and this is what we have to deal with. So we're going to come to the more important now part of the talk, is that the economy that we are now prone to teach our students, the economics we're now prone to teach, and the economics that shows up in political discourse, the economics that shows up in prosperity gospel, are all these things that we have our faith in may not, and I'm going to argue, are not guiding us in the right way. And they're guiding us away from the economy we need to have. And again, going back to this diagram, if instead you put current generations at the bottom and future generations on the y-axis, and then think about what is sustainability? Well, sustainability is when future generations are as well off as current generations. And if we don't think the economy is sustainable now, it's probably because we're at some point C, which is unsustainable. It's probably inefficient too. And we need to go to some point like B that's sustainable. But the economic reasoning that we're now teaching and the economy we kind of come to believe in, and I haven't mentioned how growth is essential for redistribution, or we always teach that, well, when we grow, we'll redistribute, even though we've been growing for the last 30, 40 years without redistributing. We've redistributed to the top. If we really have to, cut back in the current generation so that future generations can have their share, that's a moral decision. Economists usually see this as an investment decision. Should we invest in mitigating greenhouse gases now? Should we invest in renewable energy? Should we invest in energy efficiency? Should we invest in transit systems, densification of the cities? It's always, are these investments worthwhile? And when you're in investment mode, you're always in a mode of, are we going to get a return? Now, that's called the discount rate or the interest rate, and economists have had great battles about what should the long-term interest rate be in order to get around the problems of our short-term rates. Well, right now they're near zero anyway, and we're still not making the transition to protecting future generations. But it's usually, from an economic perspective, all wrapped up in the discount rate or the interest rate as to how we think about whether we are getting a return on our investments rather than are we protecting future generations and seeing that they have rights to biological diversity? Do they have rights to climate that's not grossly changed? Do they have rights to a way of living which is meaningful? Are we passing on meaningful lives to our children and their children? And those are moral questions, and they're intertwined with economics because we want to go to that new economy effectively, efficiently, but the actual goal is a moral goal, and in effect needs to be decided by moral means, not by economists leading the troops. So I've had a little experience with this diagram. And a former graduate student, Richard Howarth, built overlapping generations. We eventually got the generations out to infinity and showed that, yes, you could build overlapping generations models, and when you protected future generations, you got a different interest rate over time than if you didn't protect future generations, and it's a lower interest rate. So if we care about the future, we will not insist for such a high rate of return for ourselves. That doesn't sound terribly different than the way we treat our children. We give our children all kinds of things we hope will really make their lives meaningful and effective, and sometimes the return is barely there or not there, or it's just a negative return, and yet we do it anyway because it's the right thing to do, and we keep doing it until our children turn out sort of right. Okay. I could tell the story of 4 different children, but I won't do that. I'm still involved with 2. So when sustainability was a big issue in economics, I actually got this published in the American Economic Review. Not long after that, Resources for the Future, which is an important resources non-governmental organization research group, gathered a group of economists together, put that diagram on the cover of a book, but had a bunch of articles within it that said, yeah, that's okay, but it's not necessary. You don't have to go into this general equilibrium theory and appeal to moral criteria. Markets and investment thinking is good enough. And so I've gone from this sort of, thank you, for coming up with this diagram to, no, we don't want to work this way. And even as one of the 100 experts in the scoping committee of the fifth assessment of the IPC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this was declared to be ecological economics, not economics. It's pure, straight economics. But it didn't fit the ideology of the dominant climate change economists. And it also doesn't show growth very nicely. It kind of looks like, you know, the boundary of future generations. There's limits to growth. And that's too ecological for a lot of economists. So this faith, you know, cuts all these different ways. And my own faith is certainly much more ecological and much more grounded on that side than grounded in growth will keep getting us out of trouble. Okay, where am I? So I am arguing that the problem has been that we have not really maintained this lively balance between efficiency thinking and moral thinking that was very much there in the 1880s. And it got pushed aside for the professionalization of economics. And by the professionalization, it could be the separation of economics. And of course, the disciplines all separated. There's economics and sociology. And within economics, we separate out into smaller and smaller subgroups. And that separateness, instead of the thinking and wholeness, is very much a part of the issue. But we were less separate 120 years ago than we are now as an economics profession. Economics has invaded Christianity, and that's, you know, should be a little more the other way around, but prosperity gospel is important, powerful, and it's basically come to our church, fill our coffers, and God will bless you. Excuse me if I'm too blunt, but they use a lot of economic language also. They are definitely pleading to people who are needing this kind of reassurance. And so the great poverty that has been created in the United States in the last 40 years by the economic policies that we have followed have brought us to the situation where this religious belief has become very powerful, and it's also happening around the world. Okay, and I don't want to defend religion as being some sort of angel. Religion has all kinds of bad history, too. I'm not, you know, but it has been the primary institution that has passed on moral thinking. And if it's not going to be the primary institution that passes on moral thinking, or if it's not an institution like it used to be or like I thought it ought to have been, then we need to get back to humanism and keep working more, because we need the moral part as well as the efficiency part. Okay, I wasn't actually going to show that. But yes, that's a Christian economist from the prosperity gospel side. Literally, I mean, it's just hard to read for me. Okay. So I'm going to stop. I hope I hope I've created enough trouble and not offended too many of you too deeply, or all of you just enough. Yes.
So then, moving forward, humanism, morality, and economics, what's the ideal? What's the vision? Not too utopian, maybe something we can all be working for.
Yeah, give her the mic.
Could you just repeat your question?
Sure. Thank you for your lecture. So, given everything you've presented so far, maybe a call for humanism, certainly a call for moral reasoning within economics. How do you propose we move forward? What would it look like at a policy level, and maybe what would it look like as community activists and in our personal lives?
You're asking for one answer?
I'm asking with both hands.
I'm very much a pluralist. I've written a book on methodological pluralism. Well, methodological pluralism is very much a part of the book. I think we do need to go back into all the communities that we have attachments to, or maybe go back to our parents' communities, and reattach to them as a younger generation, wherever they may be, maybe in the great Midwest especially, but Pennsylvania is not the great Midwest, coal country, and be in discourse about who we are and what we're doing, and is this going to, is what are we doing is really what we want. I think that we have the resources to do it, but I think as scholars, we need to be crossing boundaries. I have had the good fortune to be in a situation where I could cross boundaries. I mean, it cost me probably $70,000 in my retirement salary per year, but I've been able to serve on the dissertations of nuclear engineers, and I have one more theology student that I'm working with, and I've worked with 5 or 6. But I've worked with, environmental historians and sociologists, and we just need to do a lot more boundary crossing and building those bridges and understanding where they are. And as scholars, I think with students, we need to listen to them and help build, coming from where they're coming from, and try not to just sort of just color over what they come with, and just try to enrich. So I'm very much an enricher rather than a single language or a single right answer person. Okay. Yeah.
Next, I'll just bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you again for speaking with us this evening. I think it's fascinating that in particular you work in the field of energy and resource economics, and as somebody who's in the undergraduate program studying quantitative economics, I have been indoctrinated into the idea that formulas and graphs can solve all of our problems. So is there a problem with the current thinking that pursuing efficiency in the privatization of natural resources, or what resources are still important, such as fossil fuels and water resources? Would you be in support of continuing the efficiencies promoted by private industry in those fields, or is that somewhere that we need to, like energy and resources, we need to be publicly?
Okay. So let me give you an example, and again, it'll be from my life, but I'm married to the woman who is sort of the inventor of what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And in renewable energy, it's basically you set a goal, and then you have tradable obligations for sellers of electricity, and they need to hold a certain number of certificates from renewable producers, and it's a market. It's a market for obligations. That goal has to be set morally. But Nancy Rader and I wrote the first article, and she learned her economics from me, and she's still working on that stuff.
Is that principle or that methodology that she developed, is that similar to the carbon credit plan that we're now discussing?
It would be, yes, it's a parallel. Yeah, one is a requirement or the other is an obligation. But yeah, they're parallels. But again, to set, cap and trade, somebody has to set the cap. How do you set the cap? You morally set the cap. And then market mechanisms can help you get there, but you need to morally set that cap.
Thank you.
But I think we need a deeper discussion beyond that, because if you think about the whole economy needing to shift, then that's more than sort of this sort of single market cap and trade amendment thing. So yes, but I'm not against efficiency, certainly not. Go easy on the math, though.
Nice, very good lecture. We got here a little late, but what I heard is awesome. I guess it's no mystery or no secret that Americans have very short attention spans. And I think that's reflected in our business philosophy too. How do we get business and the people who really control capital in this and thereby energy in this country and the world now, because it's multinational, how do we get them to push their business horizon out not 5 years or even 10 years, but 100 years? How do we do that?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer, but I think it's not that they, it's not that their horizons are short, it's that most of our horizons are too short. And if we really shift our horizons significantly, then they'll shift with us. But yeah, I'm not in a very accusatory mood. I'll say capitalist because that describes a system and a lot that's around it, but not in so derogatory a sense. That really, there are certainly corporate groups, and Astrid would be the best one to speak to how you get people to shift and develop a longer perspective. There are many people who can afford to do better things, who are doing better things, and it's because they have other better things they really want to do. Some of them still do not treat their workers as well as they should, of course, but that's another issue. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your lecture tonight. It was broad and deep at the same time. I was intrigued by the few remarks you made comparing Sweden and the United States. And you indicated that, well, you can have two models that work in that framework that you proposed. And yet the concept of working means working well or working to some degree. It's a relative thing. So how do you know something is working well? And what is your current view of that particular comparison there? Footnote here is I've spent the last 30 years living in Sweden.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know more about Sweden than I do. I only drop in a week at a time, and probably starting 30 years ago. I think it's more a discussion we ought to be having than my being able to say how we know it's working well. I don't think very many people in the United States think what we have now is working well. I don't think more than 10, 15% of the people probably think it's working well. But maybe Pew Charitable Trust or Pew has a better answer to that than I have. But for me, working well would be, are you confident your children are going to be living as well as we have been able to live, and their children, and I've in my 73 years I've had just an extremely privileged life. I came out of middle class, they became upper middle class, well, lower middle class became upper middle class, and then became a professor, which is just its own class, where I get to travel and think and, you know, be with great people. So I've had this extremely good life. And so I'm in a biased position, being concerned about my own children. But I know my daughter, who is also a professor, the situation in the university is not nearly as bright as it was when I entered became a faculty member in 1970 at Berkeley. And were I to start again at Berkeley, it would not be nearly as bright. Yeah.
Other questions?
So from what I know, I'm a fan of the master's program at Berkeley in, is it resources and energy?
Energy and resources, yes.
Energy and resources. And I think a lot of people in my circle are excited by the idea of going out and learning things like you have learned them and talking about them well, and thus pushing a good society that way. I'm wondering if you have some degree of skepticism about whether institutions are adequate to make that happen, and whether especially an institution as world-renowned and even dependent on certain funding as Berkeley is,
Yeah.
Is too ingrained in the system as you have described it to create minds that can solve these problems.
Ultimately, our institutions are us. It's going to take a long time to change them. It took a long time to change the University of California from what it was to what it is, but it could be changed back by richer ideas, newer ideas, more community, future-oriented ideas, more care-oriented ideas. And it's up to us to speak to those things and be out there and, through our churches, through our universities, through our legislators, by showing up at rallies, but by showing up at hearings, changing what we're calling these institutions, which at any moment of time are, terribly rigid, but in fact change. And they change because we have changed in the past, and they need to change again. But it's in fact it's us. It's the Pogo cartoon of the late '60s, I guess. We have met the enemy, and he is us, or she is us. I frequently show the Pogo cartoon during the environmental movement, where, too long. Wrong generation. There's only a half dozen of you here who remember Pogo.
Maybe if I could just interject, your presentation really emphasized the present versus the future,
Yeah.
the discount rate, and what we're willing to sacrifice for future generations. The countries I tend to work in are lower income countries. There's a contemporaneous issue as well, I think, and wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah. No, we have, over the last 70 years, led a lot of low-income countries into a situation where they're not necessarily better off, though in some there is a growing middle class, but certainly in others there's a rich that is much richer than it used to be in the 1950s. And they too have come and sucked into the dream that we were living, and what's our obligation to help get them out? I guess it works the other way. When I go to low-income countries and see how caring and how important life is to people who are living at much lower levels than we are, and they're still finding meaningful lives. That's a lesson to me that's more powerful than anything I can give to them, frankly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your talk. I have to say, I would love to know if your slides are available online, because I would like to go back through them and see if I can absorb more. I'm not an economist, but I am very interested in your thinking about the church's involvement with the influence over economic thinking. But also, I'm wondering if this whole Western individualism
Yeah.
and our shift, I work in the field of psychology. I wonder about we're shifting gradually in psychology to think more relationally. Is that something that's going to help move us in a more systemic perspective or more relational direction?
Yes. And so to elaborate, we've had atomism and we've had individualism for years, but also during the Enlightenment, atomism and individualism sort of came in much more strongly. In fact, Hobbes helped introduce Greek ideas of atomism to both the natural sciences and the social sciences. And of course, Adam Smith, his first book is about theory of moral sentiments, which is relational. And then he writes a book about individuals and individual greed. And, you know, how did that one mind shift that way so smoothly? But we picked up his second book instead of his first. He meant to write 7 or 8 books on covering all of philosophy, but yeah, he had limits too. But yes, we should stick much more with his relational book and keep that in mind. Yeah. Thank you, Linda and Anne.
I want to thank you also for tonight's talk as a renewal of my interest in skepticism in economic ideas and the idea that they're very religious, because as somebody who came to economics through your classes, I was really happy to hear that there's room for that, and I think there still has to be.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm wondering how you see utilitarianism as a means of finding a forward path, but when we think about the greatest good for the greater group,
Yeah.
I guess what I'm reminded of too is that greater group has to include the yet to be born generations. So do you think that that's something that we can learn from a country who's doing that, or people who are doing that? And
I think utilitarianism has been just an extremely productive idea, not always good. And the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number or greatest, what's that mean? Philosophers have been stuck with that for a long time. I think that was just we got to say something about the greater good, so we might say this. I would just go much back to our natural instincts of care, and then just go back to the beginning of my lecture. We work better because of moral rules. And right now our moral rules are mostly economics. How we relate to people in China is all through the market and was justified by economics instead of how, maybe we should relate to people in China. So it's, I don't try to use utilitarianism and try to save it. I just soon bypass it.
I wonder if you could comment on whether you think that trying to put in moral rules into economics could have a dark side, so to speak. So I'm thinking about the Washington state carbon tax in the last election that was defeated in large measure because progressive groups like the Sierra Club opposed it on the grounds that they didn't like where the revenue went. Right? It didn't go to enough social and environmental justice. Right? So we could have a carbon tax now in Washington, and it seemed like a pretty strong proposal, and we don't.
Yeah, and so in California, the environmental justice groups are extremely strong, and in some ways rightfully so, because we have some extreme injustices in California. And the Energy and Resources Group has been very positive in bringing forth the environmental justice in in scholarly work. I supervised Michael Galopter's dissertation. It was the first PhD in environmental justice. Robert Bullard was hosted by me at the Energy and Resources Group. There's, you know, it's hard to write a simple carbon tax or a simple cap and trade program and mix it in with environmental justice. Economics is powerful because it's simple, and to make it as rich as we need to make it to get through what we need to get through and achieve all we need to achieve is really hard work, and they're doing a lot of that. But yes, that whole issue of justice is constantly being stumbled on in Sacramento, and yet we keep working with it. But you know, there isn't a right answer. Economics is accustomed to having, you know, the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. We got it. And yeah, it's just the marginal revenue of those who happen to have money and the marginal cost of those who happen to be producing now. Yeah.
Other questions? One more? Oh, you got it.
And that is, I work in natural resources and forestry, and my skepticism arises from, I mean, I'm pro-capitalism in a lot of ways, but the privatization and then how companies are then maybe publicly traded and beholden to stockholders instead of to communities.
Yeah.
How do we as communities work with, I mean, along with Citizens United, you know, that decision that corporations are people and have obligations to stockholders rather than to communities,
Okay.
especially in terms of forest resources or water resources.
So economics is pinhead economics. It has no geography, it has no space, and space is extremely important. And once you start bringing in size of community, it's extremely important. You get transactions costs, and that's part of economics, but it's not taught enough and not really brought into what its political consequences are. And so the only book I've actually completed myself, a solely authored book, ends up picturing a world of many more communities interconnected but not globalized. And part of the argument is just the one you're making, that when it gets really big, then power can get out of the hands. But when it gets really big, it's hard to discuss complex things that you're trying to reach. And you know, it's really hard in 38 million people in California. 38 million is too many probably, but we're still hanging on compared to the rest of the United States, as is Oregon and yeah, us West Coasters. Yeah, there's East Coasters too, Northeast Coasters, yeah. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, if not, I'd just like to mention that the video that you see, you know, the taping that's occurring, this will be posted up on the Institute for Economics and the Environment website probably in a couple days, so people can watch that, and you can watch all the talks that we've hosted. I haven't asked about the PowerPoint. Someone asked about that, but
So I'd be happy to, I guess, dumb them down so they're small enough to send, or you can just have the stick I gave you and deal with it yourself, and I'm happy to have them posted.
okay. Well, thank you. It sounds like we've got that as well.
Yeah.
So maybe join me in thanking Professor Norgaard for his talk.
Thank you.